So because every democracy seminar where Jeff and I have both been present, I have said black and Jeff said white. I said white, Jeff said black. I told him last night that I was going to say Jeff Goldfarb is great. And so I leave the other side to him.
I disagree.
Really want to talk about Jeff's time in South Africa, which is quite a substantial part of Jeff's biography, but perhaps not so visible to everybody here because, you know, South Africa. But I think it's a really interesting way to think through some of the issues that have been raised already about the politics of small things. So when Jeff arrived in South Africa for the first time in 1999, it was 5 years after democracy had been installed as the new political system. And the country was all about the big questions: revolution, justice, freedom, the people, who in South Africa we call the masses. Right? It was really an exhilarating era in which the last country on the African continent to be fully decolonized was still caught up in this hubristic mode, in the sense that democracy was a system that could and would be made to work. The very first meeting of the Democracy and Diversity Institute in Cape Town, this institute, many of you know from its Polish variants, the brainchild of Elżbieta, and the South African version of it was cooked up between Elżbieta and Stephen Gellert, and then me as a sort of what we call a handlanger in South Africa, someone who joined in. This amazing institute had as part of its rationale the idea that in Eastern Central Europe, a similar kind of transition was happening from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, and that there might be fruitful conversations to be had across these different spaces. And in the very first one in 1999, there were such an amazing array of speakers that when I look back on it, I wonder how we pulled it off. And I feel like we could not pull it off in South Africa today. And I'll explain a little bit about why that is. Because who we heard from at that time were people across the political spectrum, apart from the right wing, of course. We had Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert, who was a white member of parliament, a liberal, who had walked out of parliament, disbanded his political, or abandoned his political party, and opened the first talks between white South Africans and the African National Congress in Dakar, Senegal. You know, all through that political spectrum, the deputy chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Dumisa Nsabeza, a most inspiring speaker, Neville Alexander, who had been on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela, but was not from the African National Congress, and had a very different conception of non-racialism. So these were all the people, Father Michael Lapsley. These were the great and the good of South Africa, unfettered, it seemed at that moment, unfettered by the old, embarking on building this great new society. We no longer had restrictions on who might gather, no fear of security police lurking in the room, who might later on that night knock on the door and arrest one of us. I mean, this was a society that was only, it was a few years away from having laws that made it illegal to publicly show the photograph of Nelson Mandela, never mind quote Nelson Mandela. So it was a very exciting and heady period in which I think South Africa, this honeymoon phase of democracy was being looked at around the world as an experiment that might finally work. And in Africa, certainly an experiment that would, it seemed, would work. There was a world historic sense about South Africa in that moment. And it felt that non-racialism as a value was very firmly rooted in our political culture. And it was rooted in a way that it wasn't rooted in the United States, that there was, that the racial question could be resolved in South Africa in a way that at the time didn't look like it had been resolved in other parts of the world. And that the Constitution had this popular legitimacy. It wasn't a distant 100-year-old or hundreds of years old document. And it was moreover a constitution which was recognized as being in advance of any other written constitution. It would command the state to redistribute power and resources. And then, of course, we had the leadership of Nelson Mandela, which we thought was the imprint for all future forms of political leadership. So I'm making it sound more naive than it actually was. It's not that there were not discordant voices, that there were not already huge anxieties about this democratic project. But I think there was at the time a belief that there were local idioms of democracy that would be the resources to take the society forward. And over the following decade and a half, when we had the Institute in Cape Town and then in Joburg, Jeff's role was to constantly remind the participants in the Institute that democracy was not just a set of beautiful institutions, but that it entailed relationships between people, that society was going to be made in and remade in these interactions between people through a set of iterative practices. So in fact, that some of the hardest work was yet to come, and that was the work of living together, that the systematic division legalized, enforced through security police and so on may have been dismantled, but that people would have to live together in ways and spaces that operated on a different scale, on a small scale, a different scale to the grand public conversation that instituted the shift from authoritarianism to democracy. So, as I understood Jeff's interventions in the Democracy and Diversity Institute, he was not saying we shouldn't discuss the big questions, but rather that we should do so using a grammar that was more capacious than the rhetorical terms of revolutionary movements. So that scaling down was not scaling down the importance of the questions, but rather scaling it down to the person-to-person encounter. And to a language that each could understand. How, having dismantled apartheid as a legal system, how would people address the other without invoking new forms of tyranny? That required an openness to different viewpoints, which Elżbieta and Jeff and all of us in the Institute tried to model by bringing people together across these incredible boundaries and by discovering the similarities of the experience of living under authoritarian rule, however different they were in Eastern Central Europe and the 20-odd African countries that were represented in the Institute. It required an openness that meant that you had to leave behind inherited positions. You had to step out of these traps of party and ideological fidelity, of which we got a huge amount in the Institute from the students themselves, right? We're really trapped in fidelity to political parties and the inherited languages that came from pamphlets, essentially. It was, I think, an uphill battle to focus on the small L liberalism that Jeff was wanting us to talk about. And in the 15 years, as we saw generation upon generation of students coming into the Institute, increasingly what we saw was not a language of openness and tolerance, but increasingly a language of disappointment, a turning to rage, an impatience with democracy, a displacement of the anger with political leaders. And, we can talk about why there was anger, but a displacement of that anger, not placing responsibility onto political leaders, but repositioning old leaders as still responsible for the problems of the present, and quite a ready turn to violence as the years progressed. A situation that by 2015, I think, which was our last institute, in which affect displaced ideas, when we moved from a passionate engagement across difference to passion for the sake of passion, passion for the sake of staking out a ground that was separate and different, and in which the kinds of civility that Jeff was arguing for were understood to be an outmoded form of so-called respectability politics, right? As a limitation to voice rather than the basis for amplifying voice. To a situation, I think, where who says something became more important than what was said, and where the emphasis was not on what might hold us together, but increasingly obsessively an emphasis on what divides us. It's not surprising that by 2015, 2016, the most circulated theorist on the Wits campus, outside of class materials, was Carl Schmitt, and the language of friends and enemies, and the sudden concern with identifying who was actually the enemy, and the circle of friends became increasingly smaller, and suspicion and denunciation, or what you might call calling out, that was the language, calling out people became a much more common mode of conversation on our campus and on all university campuses. So everyone became very clear about what they were against. No one was articulating in meaningful terms, what is it that we are for? Jeff's emphasis on everyday encounters and on small acts, I think, offers a form of politics, as many have said, that is precisely against a politics rooted in anger and despair. Far from being an easy way out, it requires some of the hardest acts. It requires us to recognize the other as human in a period of categorical distrust, in which the distrust, where it became once again life and death, that distrust, that the idea that someone's right to actually exist depended on the obliteration of the other. I'm not really exaggerating. In 2008, we had some of the most violent outbreaks of xenophobia in our country, in which people were, in fact, killed. It felt like one could pull that back in 2008, but last year and this year, there's again a rise of xenophobic violence. In 2008, that xenophobic violence was denounced by every single political party. Now it is the basis on which political parties are articulating their electoral vision. That's what they're offering people. We will protect South Africans and get rid of foreigners from our townships. So nobody's talking about how in the here and now we might forge alternatives that make sense, right? That are inherently hopeful because they imply the possibility of a shared future, a future in which we will still have to live together. But instead, we are consumed by the past and seem to be working away obsessively at wounds. And I find myself agreeing with Jeff about memory and its problems, its problematic uses. Maybe, you could say that South Africa just became an ordinary country after all. That's true. We just became another country. And some racists say, I don't say it, But people do say, oh, well, it's just Africa. This is how Africa is. I don't believe that. The past few years, the gap that was left, anyway, for me, by the end of the South African Institute, has been filled by Jeff and Elżbieta by various other events. I love to go to Poland. It's one space where we continue to discuss these issues, but the public seminar and then democracy seminar has opened that space. And Jeff, I want to thank you for your continued commitment to engaging questions of democracy from context other than the United States. Not just Poland, but South Africa, now Afghanistan. And this is not just as simple as inviting people from those countries to enter the conversation, right? Because the truth is we do not speak across geographies very much. We don't have, we no longer, you know, that this gap between what they call the global north and the global south is growing. It's not closing down, it's growing. It's even more difficult. I mean, you'll remember this, Jeff and Elżbieta. Judith has been to our institute in Cape Town as well and visited us. Rachel taught in it. So there are people here who know it well, that it was very difficult to do this even between faculty in the Democracy and Diversity Institute. We had a policy in South Africa that every course was co-taught by someone from the New School and someone from a South African university. And the reason for that was because we recognized even in 1999 that the idea that Americans could come to Africa and talk about democracy would not fly, right? Couldn't happen. But I would say that those co-teaching relationships were not easy, and very few were sustained over multiple years. Of course, Elżbieta and I taught and continue to teach jointly, very, very happily, but we were the only ones who could do that. And I think it's partly because feminism created a common conversation for us, right, that we could sustain. So we couldn't even do it as faculty often, and yet we were hoping that the students would do it. It was difficult. The linguistic registers of politics are different. Words in an Alice in Wonderland kind of way mean one thing in one place and another elsewhere. And converging on common meanings, requires very long and patient work. And Jeff kind of signed up to that job. He took it on, as Siobhan spoke about his convening capacity of the round table and the seminar and so on, convening these conversations across difference with great skill, with a genuine interest in learning about elsewhere, with an encouragement, even, and I'll say this to me personally, that this was a conversation worth making an effort to be part of, rather than throwing up my hands in horror and saying, no one wants to listen to us in Africa. He kept coming back to it because I think Jeff has this profound belief that somehow we will reach some spaces of agreement, and out of those spaces of agreement, something different will emerge that is better. Doing it at the moment in the age of decoloniality, which is a big word that is stalking African studies, I think is especially brave because, decoloniality is this set of ideas that the whole of intellectual history has been the imposition of Western universalism on the rest of the world, right? It's a deeply dividing way of thinking about the history of ideas, in which there's just there's the power of the West, and then the empty vessels of the South. And nobody could think. We just had these Western ideas poured down into our heads like through a funnel. You can tell I'm not a big fan of those decoloniality arguments, some and ideas such as epistemic genocide and so on. But to do it, for the kind of project Jeff is doing, to be doing it today in that context is incredibly courageous. I don't know that we've fully succeeded in building the bridge between the South and the North, but I applaud Jeff for encouraging us to continue to try building that bridge and to repairing the parts that break. I'll just say finally a word about Jeff and friendship. That I've known Jeff for quite a long time. He's seen my children grow up because they were schlepped along to the institute in Cape Town, and Jeff knew me before I had a PhD. And has spent, it's been very formative, but Elżbieta and Jeff have been formative in drawing me into a North American orbit. And I'm deeply grateful for that, and deeply blessed to have known, have got to know Naomi a little bit as well, who came to Cape Town and saw her in Poland. And so I feel like in some ways, this is a friendship that is like family. And this family that Elżbieta, you initially curated is a strong one. So thank you very much.